Non-duality. You may have heard this term before in passing, or maybe you read about it in a book, or maybe you heard it on a podcast, meditation podcast, or maybe if you're watching this video, I guess there's a good chance you're like me and you've watched endless hours of YouTube videos sort of talking about non-duality, or maybe you also, like me, spend time on Reddit and other forums arguing about non-duality. Um, but either way, it's a little bit of a tricky word, concept, term, in that it's very difficult to talk about, and yet it's also extremely simple. So I wanted to make this video, and frankly, future videos, really just to talk about it, to talk about what it means, to me at least, um, what I've gleaned from my experiential sort of approach, experiences that seem to resonate with some of this non-dual talk. And yeah, so I just wanted to make a video to really explore it, right? And mostly for the sake of exploring it myself, right? But also connecting with others out there that may be similar to me, that have heard, again, tons of hours of others talking about it, pointing to non-duality, and or maybe just curious. The other big one is, those who've had experiences that are hard to explain. That was for me. I'll make a video at some point to go into more detail about this apparent story that has led me to here. But long story short, there were experiences that just were so different than the day-to-day apparent reality that was being lived. And over time, it's become clear that what these non-duality videos, books, conversations appear to be pointing to is the closest I've ever experienced to tying back to some of those experiences or non-experiences, if we want to go that direction, that have been had here. So back to it, non-duality. And let me just start at, I feel as though it's important to offer up some disclaimers whenever touching on this subject. And so I'll probably have a few of them in a variety of videos here, but this is a delicate topic. Um, it can be really, it can resonate deeply, but it can also seem to create a charged response, and it can also be misused in a way of really dissociating in an unhealthy way from experience. So just a disclaimer that this shouldn't be taken lightly. It's kind of a paradox because in a way it should be taken, you know, as lightly as anything ever can be taken. But at the same time, it can have disastrous effects. Maybe a little bit like water. Water is life-giving and um, perhaps the most important substance for the human being, and yet it can be destructive when you know misused or whatever. So just a little word of warning, caution. Um, but otherwise, I hope that my unpacking some of this concept can be helpful. Um, if nothing else, just to hear another perspective, right? Because the one thing I'll continue to say is, man, there's a lot of different ways to think about this, to talk about it, to conceptualize it. It does seem like most individuals talking about this are pointing to the same thing. It's I get that sense, but they're all very different, and there can be intense arguments around it. So this is just my 2 cents. So non-duality, what is it? The first thing I'll say is spirituality often leads to non-duality. And I guess another way to say that is often when people encounter this concept of non-duality, they have come from a spiritual path, apparently. And, it can happen outside of the spiritual context, but it seems as large majority of times it's a spiritual path pointing to non-duality, leading to non-duality. And, there's other examples. I was personally influenced earlier on in my journey by things like Ken Wilber's integral model, spiral dynamics, and these are all spiritual, psychological, developmental models that sort of point to non-duality as uh, maybe the apex of the experiential mountain, um, which is helpful for a time, but it can also be a little um, misleading in some respects to focus on the progressiveness of something like that. It's one of the big arguments, frankly, in non-dual communities is there a progressive path or not? And we'll certainly get into that in future videos. But we'll just leave it there that often spiritual paths point to or lead to non duality. And there's a lot of non dual um, underpinnings or blatant non duality in some of the literature. Like the Taoist, I don't remember the exact wording, but something along the lines of the true Tao cannot be spoken. And in Christianity, which is my background and you know the dominant religion of the West, it seems, is Jesus. The cornerstone of the Christian religion had a lot of very non-dual approaches. He talked about unity a lot, which unity and non-dual are cousins, you could say, or some might say they're the same thing. Just depends on how you think of unity. Um, so, spirituality often points to non duality, but I would say that non duality is not spirituality. Now, I know that many will probably disagree with me on that, so again, this is just my take personally. But non duality is something that can be a part of any spiritual life, but it is something that to me can't be boxed in by a spirituality, if that makes sense. And maybe I'll elaborate further on that at some point. But again, so don't think of non duality as like you have to be a spiritual person to understand it or to um, have the shifting perceptions that tend to follow or precede non duality. So, again, going back to it, what is it? Well, what is non duality? And the best word that comes to mind is, well, so the natural reality. Often, like myself and others who've had experiences, glimpses, if we call them that jive very closely with what's talked about in non-duality. They are they feel more real than real, realer than real. Um, and so this word natural reality really resonates because when this non-dual um, understanding applies, it seems very natural. So non-duality is a way of describing natural reality. So we could say it that the natural reality is non-dual. So now what does that mean? And for that, I think it's helpful to actually go back to the spirituality, um, because to me there's two fundamental questions that spirituality poses. What is this? And who am I? And again, to be clear, non duality does not require someone to be a spiritual person, but these are often questions that arise out of spirituality. What is this? And who am I taking a part of this? And those are huge questions that either we actively wrestle with for much of our lives, or they're going on under the surface. So I would encourage anyone to just really ask these questions and see what happens, um, because it can be challenging, but it can also be extremely liberating to see what arises when we ask those questions. So, what is this, and who am I? So, to go back to the term non duality, the what is this, natural reality is non dual. And we'll get to the who am I part in just a second. Um, so, non dual, another terming here or definition, literally translates to not two. So, there's two, call it circles here, which we'll come back to in a second. Non duality would say this is how the world is often, how the reality is often perceived, but this is actually the natural reality. Not two, collapsing the two. And some might call this oneness, and that's okay. But a big part of the non dual pointings and understandings is that it can't actually be said what the natural reality is. So to say that the natural reality is oneness is a little bit, um, it just is maybe misleading. So there's a negation often used by those who, you know, seem very wise, the sages, the gurus, the like. Not that we need to take their word as gospel always. I think that can be a trap. But nonetheless, there is extremely valuable insights that come from those individuals who seem to have really recognized the natural reality and have a knack for speaking about it. So they use negation. Not to is the ultimate negation of the apparent human experience of reality. And so one other thing to add to the non-dual is other words that you may hear used are Advaita. So Advaita Vedanta is one of the Hindu traditions that really, you could say, kickstarted a lot of the non-dual conceptualizations. Most certainly, the actual non-dual nature of reality precedes all of that, precedes even humanity. However, it appears that the Advaita Vedanta religious tradition was one of the first to really start to directly conceptualize it. So you'll hear that term a lot with non-duality. And again, Advaita is a literal translation to non-dual. You may also hear Neo-Advaita, and it's an interesting term. So Neo-Advaita, some will say it's a derogatory term. I would probably say it's a derogatory term to sort of put down a certain style of teaching. So, for example, those that are Neo-Advaita would never call themselves a Neo-Advaita teacher. So that sort of um, indicates that it's a derogatory term. But the difference between, well, one of the differences between Neo-Advaita and Advaita is the Neo-Advaita style tends to make minimal or no compromises in the sense of pointing to the non-dual natural reality, meaning that in that approach, there is no affirmation of the individual. And we'll get to that in a second. So that's the difference is, well, and again, another way to say it is there isn't a journey for the Neo-Advaita approach. It is what it is. It's always been that way, and it will always be that way. There isn't any actual change happening. And the traditional Advaita, and frankly most other paths that point to non-duality, there's more of a progressive nature to it, where one becomes more, an individual becomes more open to those non-dual insights. So to go back to the circles, and what I think is probably the most significant part of non-duality is going back to the who am I question and the circles. I found that this illustration of it helped me a lot to really sort of get my head around this stuff as far as we can. But again, so not two is sort of what non-duality is pointing to. And so when we go to the question of who am I, we start at the beginning, the apparent beginning, right? When we're born, one could say that there is that, just one experience. There's just the raw experience of the infant being human. And then as that infant gets a little older, people argue about this. I have small children, and I don't know the right answer to this, but it seems as though somewhere in the first year or so of their life, that infant starts to develop a sense of I, a sense of me. And in that development of the I, there becomes this little circle, like a Venn diagram. I don't know how good this looks on the camera, but like a Venn diagram. So suddenly what was one sort of starts to become two. And as that human being continues to develop, that circle just becomes sort of more and more separate. So that's another word that's pointed to and often mentioned in non-duality is no separation. There isn't a separation. So this sense that there's the physical body and this sense of I. So this is me. This is my body. This is my thoughts, my life. This is where almost all, if not all, human beings end up. Me and my life, my body. And what a lot of the more mystical, spiritual traditions point to or lead us through, which is why many find non-duality through the spiritual paths, is they lead us, or ironically, they lead us here. They lead us into this sense of our true nature, which could be spirit or soul or A lot of the more Advaita oriented approaches would just call this awareness or pure consciousness, that what we are is pure consciousness. And, and in that sense, there can be a collapse of this into just the fullness of pure conscious awareness. But on the flip side, there can be also a flip into this. And this is where there are some disagreements in the non-dual space, where is what we are a pure conscious awareness that transcends the physical form, or is what we are just the pure raw sensations of the body? And in that sense, well, that can be a big argument in non-dual communities. What are we? Who am I? Um, and it can be tricky. And trust me, I've fallen into the trap of, well, which one is it? Right? It's kind of like this two sides of the same coin type of thing. And I don't think it's important necessarily to distinguish those two. I think most people are probably going to have one side of that coin that they fall on. But what's important is to recognize that, again, either are fine, but what it really points to, and what's the really important, well, I don't want to say important, but what is significant about the non-duality as experienced by the me, the sense of me, the sense of I, is it collapses. It collapses into either the no self, to the sense that all there is the raw sensations of experience, or it collapses into the supreme self. One might call this God, or just pure awareness. But either way, whichever apparent path it goes, there's a collapse of the sense of being an individual. And that is such a significant shift in experience. Because if you haven't noticed, again, going back to this, much of life is lived in this sense of, I'm here having this experience, experiencing the body, experiencing my life situation, experiencing thoughts, feelings. They're all mine. And what non-duality is ultimately pointing to is that no, that's an illusion. This sense of you, this sense of I, me, having an experience is an illusion. And that's something that can't really be understood. It's one of those things that we can point to it, we can talk about it as I'm doing here, but it seems as though it's a shift in experience that can't really be understood or explained. There are these glimpses, such that I personally had, where this sense of me was gone for a period of time. And then it comes back, and it seems like for many, there's this process that it comes in and goes out, comes in and goes out. And that's where the debates happen of, well, how do we make it permanent? How do we make it permanent? Because here's the thing, when you go back to this duality, this illusory duality, there is a tremendous unnecessary suffering caused by this sense of me, this sense of ownership of all the experience. We become attached to thoughts. We become much more likely to fall into shame and just other sort of negative feelings and emotions that just bring on the experience of suffering unnecessarily so. So there really is a beauty in recognizing the non-dual nature of reality, the non-dual nature of self. And again, it's fairly simple that the sense of you as an individual having an experience is illusory. But at the same time, it's extremely difficult because it goes against so much or all of the experience that we're having, that we've had for, in most cases, decades. My life, my thoughts, my body. This is saying all of that is an illusion. So to go back to the beginning, we don't take this lightly. It's simple, yet profound. And it can be a difficult journey once it's recognized. That loss of sense of self can be really disastrous. It can be very liberating, but disastrous when you talk about the dark night of the soul that spiritual traditions refer to. This is a lot of that, like the loss of what you've had, what apparently you've had, or even the sense of having anything can be really difficult on the conditioning and the psychology of the body. So it's a journey. It's extremely liberating. There's a lightness that comes with all of this. And that's what I'll be talking about on this channel more and more is, well, what is it? Which we're talking about now, but there's just so much more to sort of unpack. More ways to look at it, more ways to slice it, even though it can't be sliced. But for the experience of the individual, there's a lot of different ways that we can resonate, and so we'll talk about that more.